The emergency sirens hadn't stopped wailing for 3 days, and Kazimir Volkov knew that meant the military had finally abandoned the city. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the apartment window on the 14th floor, watching the streets below writhe with movement that was no longer quite human. The infected didn't walk anymore, they ran, climbed, and hunted with a coordination that defied everything the early news reports had promised. They'd said the virus made people slow and mindless. They'd lied. Behind him, Thessaly Chen frantically stuffed medical supplies into a backpack, her hands shaking so badly that bottles of pills scattered across the kitchen floor. She'd been a surgical resident before the outbreak, accustomed to saving lives under pressure, but this was different. The dead didn't stay dead anymore, and everything she'd learned about human biology had become horrifyingly irrelevant. Her younger brother, Amarian, sat cross-legged on the couch, his 13-year-old face blank with shock, staring at a silent television that showed only static. "We can't stay here anymore," Kazimir said, his Ukrainian accent thickening with stress. "The horde on 5th Avenue is moving this direction. I count maybe 300, possibly more." Thessaly looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with fear. "The evacuation points are all overrun. I heard it on the emergency radio before the broadcast cut out. Where exactly do you propose we go?" Before Kazimir could answer, someone pounded frantically on the apartment door, not the slow, mindless battering of the infected, but a desperate, rhythmic knocking that could only come from someone still human. Kazimir grabbed the aluminum baseball bat he'd kept by the window and approached cautiously. Through the peephole, he saw a woman in a torn business suit, blood streaking her face, and behind her, a young Asian man supporting an elderly woman who could barely stand. "Please," the woman gasped. "They're coming up the stairs. They followed us from the parking garage." Kasimir's jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed at him to keep the door closed, to protect his own small group, but the woman's eyes held the same terror he'd seen in his sister's face the day she died in his arms, 6 days into the outbreak. He unbolted the door and yanked it open, pulling the 3 strangers inside just as the stairwell echoed with inhuman shrieks. The woman in the business suit introduced herself as Svetlana Petrov, a lawyer from the 10th floor. The young man was Hiroki Nakamura, an IT specialist who'd been trapped in the building since the quarantine began. The elderly woman was Esperanza Martinez, Hiroki's neighbor, who'd broken her ankle trying to escape her apartment when the infected broke through her window. "How many floors down are they?" Thessaly asked, already moving to examine Esperanza's swollen ankle. 8, maybe 7 by now, Hiroki replied, his voice surprisingly steady despite his trembling hands. "They're learning. They're using the stairs instead of just climbing the outside of the building. It's like they're adapting." Kazimir moved back to the window and felt his blood turn to ice. The horde on 5th Avenue had reached their building. More horrifying still, some of the infected had stopped directly below and were staring upward, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, as if they could sense the living flesh 14 stories above them. Then, as if receiving some silent signal, they began to climb. "We have 5 minutes, maybe less," Kazimir announced, forcing calm into his voice. "There's a maintenance ladder that leads to the roof. From there, we can cross to the adjacent building. It's only a 2-meter gap." "With a broken ankle?" Svetlana protested, gesturing to Esperanza. "Then we carry her," Thessaly said firmly, her medical training overriding her fear. "Because staying here means we all die." Amarian finally spoke, his young voice cutting through the adults' panic. "They're faster than us, and there's more of them. We can't just run. We need to be smarter." The boy stood and walked to the kitchen, pulling open drawers until he found what he was looking for, a box of matches and a bottle of cooking oil. He looked at the adults with an expression far too old for his face. "We need to slow them down. Give ourselves time. As the shrieks in the stairwell grew louder, closer, the 7 survivors looked at each other, understanding that their survival now depended not just on speed or strength, but on their ability to think, adapt, and work together. The world they'd known was gone. The question now was whether they could become something more than prey. The flames spread faster than Casimir had anticipated, consuming the cooking oil Amarian had poured across the apartment's entrance with hungry efficiency. Black smoke billowed toward the ceiling, triggering the fire sprinklers that hadn't worked in days, instead releasing only a pathetic sputter of rust-colored water. Through the thickening haze, they could hear the infected on the other side of the door, their shrieks turning to something that almost sounded like rage as the fire blocked their path. Go now. Casimir shouted, ushering everyone toward the back hallway where a narrow service door led to the maintenance areas. Hiroki had already pried it open with a screwdriver from Thessaly's makeshift toolkit, revealing a dark corridor that smelled of mildew and decay. Thessaly and Svetlana supported Esperanza between them, the elderly woman biting her lip to keep from crying out as her broken ankle bounced with each hurried step. Amarian led the way with a flashlight scavenged from under the kitchen sink, its weak beam barely penetrating the darkness ahead. Casimir brought up the rear, his baseball bat ready, listening for sounds of pursuit over the hammering of his own heart. The maintenance corridor was narrower than Casimir had remembered from the building tour he'd taken when he first moved in 2 years ago. The walls seemed to press inward, lined with exposed pipes that dripped condensation and created pools of standing water on the concrete floor. Every 20 feet, steel support beams forced them to duck and weave, slowing their progress to an agonizing crawl. The ladder should be another 30 meters ahead, Hiroki called back, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. I used to come up here when the internet in my apartment went out. There's a junction box near the roof access. Behind them, the sound of splintering would announce that the infected had broken through the apartment door, flames or not. The shrieks multiplied, echoing through the maintenance corridor like the howls of hell itself. But there was something else too, a wet, slapping sound, like meat being dragged across concrete. There in the corridor, Casimir confirmed, glancing back to see shapes moving in the darkness beyond his vision. Move faster. But they couldn't move faster, not with Esperanza's injury. The elderly woman had gone pale, her breathing shallow and rapid. Thessaly recognized the signs of shock setting in and knew they had minutes, not hours, before Esperanza's condition became critical. There. Amarian's flashlight beam found the ladder, a vertical shaft of rusted metal rungs disappearing upward into darkness. A faded sign read "Roof Access, Authorized Personnel Only," a regulation that seemed almost comically irrelevant now. Svetlana reached the ladder first and immediately started climbing, her expensive heels kicked off somewhere in the darkness, her stockinged feet finding purchase on the corroded rungs. It's stable, she called down. I'm going up to check the roof exit. Hiroki turned to help with Esperanza, but Thessaly shook her head. You go next. We'll need someone strong at the top to help pull her up. She looked at her younger brother, seeing the fear in his eyes despite his earlier bravery. Amarian, you too. Climb. The boy hesitated, his hand finding his sister's. Thess. Now, Amarian. That's not a request. The infected were close enough now that their individual shapes were becoming visible in the dim light, humans who'd once had jobs and families and dreams, now reduced to shambling predators with milky eyes and mouths ringed with dried blood. Casimir counted at least 15, with more stumbling into the corridor behind them. As Hiroki and Amarian scrambled up the ladder, Casimir positioned himself between the approaching horde and Thessaly, who was fashioning a makeshift harness from her jacket to secure Esperanza for the climb. His baseball bat felt inadequate, almost ridiculous, facing down an enemy that felt no pain and feared no death. The first infected rushed forward, a woman in a nurse's uniform, her name tag still visible, Paula. Casimir swung the bat with all his strength, connecting with her skull with a sickening crunch. She went down, but 2 more immediately took her place, their fingers reaching, grasping. Thessaly. Casimir backed toward the ladder, swinging the bat in wide arcs to keep the infected at bay. Almost ready. Thessaly had looped the jacket under Esperanza's arms and was tying it to a length of electrical cable Hiroki had lowered from above. Okay, pull. Esperanza cried out as she was lifted off the ground, spinning slowly as Hiroki and Svetlana hauled her upward. Thessaly started climbing immediately after, her hands slipping on the wet rungs. Casimir waited until she was 3 meters up, then dropped his bat and jumped for the lowest rung. His fingers closed around the metal just as the infected reached the ladder's base. Hands grabbed his legs, pulled at his jeans. He kicked frantically, felt his boot connect with something soft, and climbed with a speed born of pure terror. Below him, the infected began to climb too. When Casimir emerged onto the roof, gasping and shaking, the first thing he saw was the gap between buildings, and it was much, much wider than 2 meters. The wind on the roof cut through their clothes like knives of ice, carrying with it the sounds of the dying city, car alarms wailing in the distance, sporadic gunfire, and underneath it all, a constant chorus of shrieks from the infected below. Casimir pulled himself fully onto the tar and gravel surface, his lungs burning, and stared at the chasm separating their building from the next. "You said 2 meters, Svetlana said accusingly, her hair whipping around her face. "That's at least 4, maybe 5. Casimir's stomach sank. From his apartment window, the buildings had looked so close together, but up here, with nothing but 14 stories of empty air beneath, the gap looked insurmountable. The adjacent building's roof was slightly lower, perhaps a meter down, but the distance across was impossible for anyone to jump, especially while carrying or supporting Esperanza. "The fire escape," Hiroki said suddenly, pointing to the far corner of their building. "There's an external fire escape that goes down the east side. We could descend a few floors and break into an apartment, then." "Then we're trapped again," Thessaly interrupted, kneeling beside Esperanza and checking her pulse. The elderly woman had lost consciousness during the climb, her breathing shallow. "She needs real medical care. We need to get to a hospital, or what's left of one." "Hospitals were the first places to fall," Svetlana said bitterly. "Everyone rushed there when they got bitten, didn't understand it was already too late." A crash from the roof access door behind them ended the debate. The infected had reached the ladder and were climbing with unnatural coordination, their bodies jerking upward in movements that defied normal human physiology. The door wouldn't hold long. Amarian walked to the edge of the roof, looking down at the alley 14 stories below, then across at the neighboring building. His young face was thoughtful, calculating. "There's scaffolding on the other building. Construction scaffolding, about 3 floors down. I can see it from here." Casimir joined him, following his gaze. The boy was right, metal scaffolding clung to the building's eastern face, probably from a renovation project that would never be completed. If they could somehow get across. "There." Amarian pointed to a large industrial AC unit near the roof's edge, and beside it, coiled like a sleeping metal snake, a length of heavy cable, probably left behind by maintenance workers. "We can make a zip line." "A zip line?" Svetlana looked at the boy as if he'd lost his mind. "We're not in an action movie, kid. We're regular people. We'll fall and die." "Then we stay and die here," Amarian replied with a calmness that made the adults uncomfortable. "Those are our options." The roof access door buckled inward, and a pale arm thrust through the gap, fingers clutching blindly. Time had run out. Casimir and Hiroki worked with desperate speed, securing one end of the cable to the AC unit support frame, using every knot Casimir remembered from his brief time in the Ukrainian military. The cable was heavy-duty, designed to support significant weight, but it was also stiff and awkward to handle. They threw the other end across the gap, watching it fall short by half a meter. "We need more length," Hiroki gasped. "We need to connect something else." Thessaly was already pulling off her belt, and Svetlana followed suit. They stripped electrical cable from the roof's utility boxes, twisted it together with the belts and jacket sleeves, anything flexible and strong. The makeshift extension was tied to the main cable and thrown again. This time it reached, and Hiroki used a piece of broken antenna to hook it around a pipe on the other building's roof. The access door exploded outward, and infected poured onto the roof, 10, 15, 20 of them, their eyes fixing immediately on the living humans trapped at the roof's edge. "Go!" Casimir shouted, grabbing the cable. There was no time for safety checks, no time for second thoughts. He wrapped his jacket around the cable as a makeshift pulley, lifted his feet, and slid into the void. The city spun beneath him, a dizzying kaleidoscope of concrete, glass, and the writhing mass of infected that filled every street. The cable sagged terribly under his weight, and for a horrible moment, Casimir thought the knots would fail, that he'd plummet into the horde below. But then his feet hit the scaffolding on the adjacent building, and he was across, alive, his hands bleeding from where the cable had burned through his jacket. "Send Esperanza," he called back. Thessaly and Hiroki worked together, securing the unconscious woman to the cable with their makeshift harness. Svetlana helped guide her onto the line, and Casimir pulled from his end, hauling Esperanza across hand over hand. The infected had crossed half the roof now, their shrieks reaching a fever pitch. Amarian went next, his light weight allowing him to slide across quickly. Then Svetlana, who closed her eyes and prayed in Russian as she crossed. Hiroki followed, his hands slipping halfway across, dangling for a terrifying moment before regaining his grip. Thessaly was last. She positioned herself on the cable just as the first infected reached her, its fingers brushing her back. She kicked backward, catching it in the chest, and pushed off into empty air. But the infected grabbed the cable behind her, adding its weight to the line. The knot at the AC unit began to slip. Casimir saw it happening, watched the cable shift and slide. "Thessaly, faster. The line's failing." She pulled herself hand over hand, her arms screaming, her shoulders feeling like they would tear from their sockets. Behind her, more infected climbed onto the cable, their combined weight pulling the line down, toward the alley below. The knot gave way just as Thessaly's fingers touched the scaffolding. Casimir lunged forward, caught her wrist, and pulled her onto the platform as the cable fell away, taking 3 infected with it into the void. Their shrieks cut off abruptly when they hit the pavement. For a moment, the group simply lay on the scaffolding, gasping, alive. Across the gap, the remaining infected stared at them from the other roof, swaying slightly, as if contemplating whether to jump. One did, falling like a stone, its body crumpling on impact but immediately trying to stand again despite shattered legs. "They're insane," Svetlana whispered. "They don't care if they destroy themselves." "No," Amarian said quietly, watching the infected across the gap. "They're just hungry. Hungry enough that nothing else matters." And in that moment, they all understood how thin the line was between the hunters and the hunted. The scaffolding creaked ominously under their combined weight as Hiroki forced open a window on the 9th floor, the glass already cracked from some earlier trauma. The apartment inside was abandoned but untouched by the chaos, a frozen moment from the world before. A coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter, still half full, now covered in a film of mold. A child's drawing hung on the refrigerator, depicting a family of stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. "Don't look at it," Thessaly said softly, helping Amarian through the window. "Don't think about who lived here." But it was impossible not to think about it. Every apartment, every building, every street corner held ghosts now, not the walking dead outside, but the memories of the living who'd once filled this city with laughter and life and all the mundane beautiful normalcy that had been stolen in the span of a single week. Esperanza had regained consciousness during the descent down the scaffolding, though she remained weak and disoriented. Thessaly had done what she could with their limited supplies, splinting the broken ankle properly and administering the last of their pain medication. The elderly woman's fever concerned her, possibly an infection setting in, or simply the body's response to trauma. Either way, they needed antibiotics, clean water, and rest. Casimir moved through the apartment with practiced efficiency, checking closets and under beds for supplies or threats. He found neither, just the remnants of a life interrupted, clothes still hanging in the closet, bills stacked neatly on a desk, a charging phone whose battery had long since died. He pocketed the phone charger anyway, a habit from before when such things mattered. "We need a plan," Svetlana said, peering through the curtains at the street below. The infected were everywhere, but their numbers had thinned slightly as some chased after other prey or simply wandered aimlessly. "We can't keep running from roof to roof. Eventually, we'll run out of buildings or luck." Hiroki had found a battery-powered radio and was slowly turning the dial, searching for any signal through the static. Most frequencies were dead, but occasionally a voice would break through, fragmented, desperate, or in languages he didn't understand. Then, on 97.3 FM, a recorded message played on a loop. "Sanctuary point is secure. Military presence established. Located at the Riverside Metro Station, tunnel entrance C, bring only essential supplies. Screening for infection mandatory." Message repeats, "Sanctuary point is secure. Riverside Metro," Casimir said, hope and skepticism warring in his voice. "That's 8 kilometers from here, maybe more." "Through a city full of infected," Svetlana added. "On the streets, we'd last maybe 10 minutes. "Then we don't take the streets," Amarian said, unfolding a transit map he'd found in a drawer. "We take the subway tunnels." The adults gathered around as the 13-year-old traced a route with his finger. "We're here, in the Bellwood district. The nearest subway entrance is 4 blocks south. If the tunnels are relatively clear, we could navigate underground most of the way to Riverside." "And if the tunnels aren't clear?" Thessaly asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then we die in the dark instead of the light," Amarian replied with that same unsettling calmness. "Either way, we're choosing action over waiting to be hunted." They rested for 2 hours, taking turns keeping watch while others slept fitfully on the apartment's couch and floor. Casimir found canned food in the pantry, beans, soup, vegetables, and they ate cold from the cans, savoring every bite despite the metallic taste. Svetlana located a first aid kit in the bathroom and redistributed its contents among their bags. Hiroki charged their phones using a hand-crank emergency charger, though there was no cellular service anymore, no internet, no connection to the vast digital world that had once seemed so essential. When darkness fell, they moved. The infected seemed slightly less active at night, though whether that was biology or coincidence, no one knew. The 4 blocks to the subway entrance felt like 40, every shadow a potential threat, every sound sending their hearts racing. They moved in a tight group, with Casimir leading and Hiroki bringing up the rear, while Thessaly and Svetlana supported Esperanza between them. The subway entrance yawned before them like a mouth leading into hell, a dark stairwell descending into earth, its walls covered with graffiti and peeling advertisements for shows that would never perform again. The escalators were frozen, their metal steps scattered with debris and dried blood. Somewhere below, water dripped with steady, echoing regularity. "Last chance to choose a different terrible plan," Svetlana said, her attempt at humor falling flat. Casimir descended first, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air grew cooler as they went deeper, carrying the smell of mildew, ozone, and something else, something organic and rotten that made them breathe through their mouths. The subway station platform opened before them, surprisingly intact. Vending machines stood against the walls, their glass fronts shattered and contents looted. A few bodies lay on the platform, long dead, their causes of death unclear and uninvestigated. The tracks stretched into darkness in both directions. According to Amarian's map, they needed to head north, following the red line for approximately 6 kilometers before switching to the blue line that would take them directly to Riverside. "Stay close," Casimir said unnecessarily. "Watch your footing on the tracks. And if I say run, you run and you don't look back." They dropped down onto the tracks, the electrified third rail long since powered down, and began walking into the tunnel. Their flashlights created small circles of light in the overwhelming darkness, illuminating graffiti-covered walls, maintenance alcoves, and the endless parallel lines of steel rails stretching ahead. For the first 20 minutes, they encountered nothing. The tunnel was empty, silent except for their footsteps and breathing. It was almost peaceful, this isolation from the chaos above. But then they heard it, ahead in the darkness, echoing through the tunnel, the sound of movement. Lots of movement. Casimir raised his hand, stopping the group. He switched off his flashlight and the others followed suit, plunging them into absolute darkness. They stood perfectly still, barely breathing, listening. The sounds grew closer, shuffling footsteps, wet breathing, and that distinctive keening cry of the infected. But there was something else too, something that made Casimir's blood run cold. Voices. Human voices, screaming. Light appeared ahead, flickering and wild, flames from torches or flares. A group of people burst from around the tunnel's curve, running desperately toward them. Behind the fleeing humans came the infected, dozens of them, their pale faces caught in the torchlight, their mouths open in eternal hunger. Off the tracks. Casimir hissed urgently. Into the maintenance alcove, now. They pressed themselves into a shallow alcove carved into the tunnel wall, barely large enough for all 7 of them. The fleeing group thundered past, maybe 15 people, some wounded, all terrified. The infected followed seconds later, a wave of corrupted humanity that flowed past their hiding spot like a river of death. One of the infected stopped, its head turning toward the alcove, nostrils flaring. It took a step toward them, then another. Casimir gripped his baseball bat, knowing it would be useless if the creature raised the alarm. But then one of the fleeing humans ahead fell, crying out, and the infected spun away, drawn by the sound, rejoining the hunt. They waited in the alcove for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, until the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance, leaving only screams that eventually, mercifully, stopped. "We keep moving," Thessaly said, her voice shaking. "We can't help them." They emerged from the alcove and continued north, their lights now dimmed to preserve batteries and reduce visibility. The tunnel seemed to grow colder, darker, more oppressive. They passed abandoned construction equipment, old supply caches, and more bodies, some clearly infected victims, others wearing the remains of transit worker uniforms. Then Amarian's flashlight found something that made them all stop. A barricade had been built across the tunnel, sandbags, wooden planks, metal sheets, all piled together to create a wall. And spray-painted across it in red letters 3 feet high, "Turn back. No sanctuary. Only death." "Well, that's encouraging," Svetlana muttered. They had reached the point of no return, where turning back seemed as dangerous as pressing forward, and the only certainty was that somewhere in the darkness, something was waiting. The barricade proved to be unmanned, its warning either obsolete or a deterrent that had outlived its creators. Casimir found a gap near the bottom where the sandbags had shifted, large enough for them to crawl through one at a time. On the other side, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber, an old maintenance junction where multiple subway lines once converged. What they found there defied everything they'd expected. The chamber had been transformed into a living space, a desperate, makeshift sanctuary carved from the underground. Battery-powered lanterns hung from the ceiling, casting warm pools of light across arranged sleeping areas marked by blankets and salvaged furniture. A cooking station had been set up near one wall, ventilation rigged through old air shafts. Most surprising were the people, maybe 30 of them, ranging from small children to the elderly, all staring at the newcomers with expressions mixing hope and suspicion. A man emerged from the group, perhaps 50 years old, with salt and pepper hair and a bearing that suggested military training. He held a pistol loosely at his side, not threatening but ready. "You're not infected," he said, making it half question, half statement. "No," Casimir replied carefully, positioning himself between the armed man and his group. We're trying to reach Riverside Metro. The sanctuary point. The man's expression darkened, and several of the colonists behind him exchanged glances. You heard the radio broadcast, he said. We did too, 5 days ago. Sent a group of 12 to check it out. Only 2 came back. He gestured to a young woman sitting against the wall, her eyes hollow and distant. Tell them what you found, Davina. The young woman looked up slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. There is no sanctuary. The military abandoned the position 3 days before the broadcast. The infected breached the tunnels. We found bodies. Dozens of them. People who'd followed the broadcast, thinking they'd be safe. Her voice broke. The radio message is automated. There's no one there anymore. No one alive, anyway. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. Esperanza made a soft sound of despair. Svetlana sat down heavily on the tunnel floor. Even Amarian's carefully maintained composure cracked, tears welling in his young eyes. Then what do we do? Thessaly asked, her medical training demanding solutions even when none seemed to exist. We can't survive indefinitely. Esperanza needs antibiotics. Everyone needs food, water, actual safety. The military man introduced himself as Dante Russo, formerly a sergeant in the National Guard, now the reluctant leader of this underground colony. He showed them the colony's reality. Their food supplies were dwindling, water was collected from leaking pipes and purified using methods that were barely adequate, and sickness was spreading. 3 people had died in the past week, not from infection but from dysentery and pneumonia. We've survived by staying invisible, Dante explained, leading them deeper into the colony. The infected mostly stay above ground or in the main tunnels. They don't search the maintenance areas thoroughly. But we're dying anyway, just slower. One of the colonists, a woman named Renata, approached with a child clinging to her leg, a girl no more than 5 years old, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes too knowing for her age. We heard there might be safe zones outside the city. Rural areas where the infection hasn't spread as densely. Is that true? We don't know, Hiroki admitted. We haven't heard reliable news in over a week. That night, the combined group shared what little food remained, and stories began to emerge. Dante spoke of the first days, when the military had tried to contain the outbreak, how quickly the chains of command had broken down. Renata described fleeing her apartment with her daughter, watching neighbors transform into monsters within hours of being bitten. A teenage boy named Joaquin told of losing his entire family in a single night, surviving only because he'd been hiding in a closet when the infected broke into their home. Thessaly found the colony's makeshift medical supplies, pitifully inadequate but better than nothing. She treated Esperanza's fever and several colonists suffering from infections and malnutrition. As she worked, Svetlana helped organize the remaining supplies, her legal mind applying itself to the logistics of survival with unexpected efficiency. Casimir and Dante climbed to an observation point where a maintenance ladder led to a great opening onto the street above. Through the metal slats, they could see the city burning in places, hear the constant background noise of destruction. But they could also see the stars, tiny points of light that seemed impossible in their beauty and indifference. You were military, Dante said, more statement than question. Ukrainian army, years ago, Casimir confirmed. Before I came to America looking for a better life. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. There's an option we haven't discussed, Dante said carefully. The subway tunnels connect to maintenance passages that lead to the river. There are emergency exits, drainage systems. If we could reach the waterfront, steal a boat. He trailed off, the logistics seemingly overwhelming. How many infected between here and there? Casimir asked. Unknown. But it's a chance. Better than slowly starving underground. It was Amarian who crystallized the plan, sitting with a group of children who'd gathered around him despite being older than most by only a few years. He'd spread out the transit maps and was explaining routes, possibilities, and contingencies with a strategic mind that seemed born from necessity rather than age. The Blue Line tunnel collapsed during the first bombing runs, he explained, pointing to a section marked on the map. But there's an older service tunnel that parallels it, built in the 1950s, mostly abandoned but still passable according to the schematics. It comes out near the old freight docks. The freight docks have been converted to luxury apartments, Svetlana said, then caught herself. Or they were. Before. But the old dock structures are still there, Hiroki added, catching on to the plan. Including the harbormaster's station, which would have boats. Probably small ones, but enough to get people across the river. Dante gathered the entire colony, presenting the option: stay in the relative safety of the underground, slowly dying of disease and starvation, or risk everything on a desperate run for the waterfront and possible escape. The vote was close, 15-13 in favor of attempting the escape, but those who wanted to stay were given the choice to remain. In the end, 5 people chose to stay behind, the elderly and sick who knew they'd slow the group down, making the ultimate sacrifice so others might have a chance. Esperanza was among them, despite Thessaly's protests. "I've lived my life, Mija," the elderly woman said gently, taking Thessaly's hand. "A full life, a good life. But I'll never make it to the boats, and I won't let my weakness kill children who deserve a future." She looked at Amarian, at the other young faces in the colony. "You give them that future. That's how you honor me." As they prepared to leave, Esperanza pulled Casimir aside and pressed something into his hand, a small silver locket. "This was my daughter's," she said. "She died 10 years ago, cancer. If you make it out, if you find somewhere safe, bury this somewhere green. Somewhere beautiful. So a part of her is there, in that better place." Casimir nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The combined group of 33 survivors prepared to move at dawn, or what they approximated as dawn in the timeless underground. They divided into 3 teams, Dante leading the vanguard with the strongest adults, Casimir commanding the middle group with the families and children, and Hiroki bringing up the rear with anyone who could fight. As they said their goodbyes to those staying behind, the weight of what they were attempting finally hit them all. They were betting everything on a hope, a guess, a prayer. But as Amarian had said days before, choosing action over waiting to be hunted was all they had left. The journey to the old service tunnel began in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. The tunnels grew narrower, older, their walls rough-hewn rock rather than modern construction. Water seeped from cracks, creating streams they had to wade through, the cold soaking through their shoes and stealing body heat. 2 hours in, they found the first bodies, construction workers from the 1950s, their remains still wearing rotted hard hats, skeletal hands clutching ancient tools. The dead had been here long before the infection, a reminder that death was nothing new, just more immediate now. Then the tunnel widened, and they heard water, not dripping but flowing, the distinctive sound of a river. They were close. But so were the infected. The shrieks echoed from somewhere ahead, drawing closer. The freight dock tunnel ended at a massive gate, its iron bars thick with rust and covered in warning signs from a bygone era, authorized personnel only, and, danger, deep water. Through the gaps in the gate, they could see moonlight reflecting off the river, close enough to touch, salvation tantalizingly near. The gate was locked with a chain that had oxidized into near-solid mass over decades of neglect. "Stand back," Dante said, raising a fire axe they'd scavenged from an emergency station. The metal rang against metal, sparks flying in the darkness. Each strike echoed through the tunnel like a bell, announcing their presence to anything with ears to hear. The shrieks answered immediately, multiplying, converging on their location from multiple directions. The infected had been in the tunnels all along, dormant or hunting elsewhere, but now they were coming, drawn by the sound like sharks to blood in water. "Faster!" Svetlana urged, watching their backtrail where flashlight beams were beginning to appear, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, an army of the dead flowing through the tunnels. Casimir organized the defenders into a line, placing anyone who could hold a weapon between the gate and the approaching horde. He found himself standing next to Joaquin, the teenage boy whose family had died in the outbreak's first days. The boy held a length of pipe with white-knuckled intensity, his young face set with grim determination. "When they come, aim for the head," Casimir instructed, though it seemed inadequate advice facing an enemy that felt no fear and no pain. "And don't let them surround you." Dante's axe finally broke through the chain, and the gate swung open with a groan of protesting metal. The river lay before them, perhaps 30 meters across at this point, its far shore dark and unknown. The old freight dock structure still clung to the waterfront, a skeletal framework of wood and metal pilings, most collapsed into the water, but a few sections still intact. "Boats!" Renata called out, pointing to where 3 small vessels were tied to the pilings, a motorboat with a cracked hull, a rowboat that looked barely seaworthy, and a small yacht that had clearly been someone's pride and joy before the world ended. "Get everyone to the boats," Dante ordered. "Prioritize children and anyone injured. Move." The infected hit their defensive line like a wave breaking on rocks. Casimir swung his baseball bat with mechanical precision, each impact sending shocks up his arms, each fallen infected immediately replaced by another. Beside him, Joaquin fought with fury born of grief, his pipe rising and falling in a rhythm of survival. Thessaly was herding children toward the boats, counting heads, ensuring no one was left behind. Amarian helped the smaller children into the yacht, his young voice calm despite the chaos, telling them stories to keep them from looking at the battle behind them. Svetlana and Hiroki worked the motorboat's engine, coaxing it to life with prayers and mechanical knowledge pulled from memories of different lives. "It's working!" Hiroki shouted as the engine coughed, sputtered, and finally caught, its rumble a beautiful sound amid the shrieks and screams. The defensive line was collapsing. There were simply too many infected, and the defenders were exhausted, outnumbered, overwhelmed. Dante gave the order to fall back, and they retreated in stages toward the boats, fighting for every meter. Casimir saw it happen in horrible slow motion. Joaquin stumbled on the wet dock, his pipe slipping from his hands. An infected woman, impossibly fast, lunged forward, teeth finding the boy's shoulder. Joaquin screamed, and Casimir was there, bat crushing the infected skull, pulling the boy back. But they both knew it was too late. The bite was deep, the infection already spreading through Joaquin's bloodstream. "Get to the boats," Joaquin gasped, blood spreading across his shirt. "Go." "No, we can," Casimir began, but Joaquin shook his head. "I'm dead anyway. But I can buy you time." The boy picked up his pipe and turned back toward the infected, walking toward them with steady steps, drawing them away from the retreating survivors. His screams as they took him down would haunt Casimir's dreams for whatever remained of his life. The last defenders reached the boats just as the infected poured onto the dock. Dante fired his pistol, each shot precise, each bullet buying seconds. When the magazine emptied, he threw the useless weapon into the river and jumped aboard the rowboat, grabbing oars. "Go, go, go!" Thessaly shouted, untying the last mooring line. The 3 boats pushed away from the dock as the infected reached the water's edge. Some dove in after them, their bodies sinking immediately, pulled down by waterlogged clothes and lungs that no longer needed air. But others stood at the dock's edge, swaying, watching, their pale faces caught in the moonlight like a shoreline of ghosts. The motorboat led the way, Hiroki at the helm, navigating through debris and darkness. The yacht followed, its sails useless without wind, drifting on the current. The rowboat came last, Dante and 2 others pulling at the oars with desperate strength. They were halfway across when Renata's daughter pointed back toward the shore they'd fled. "Look," the child said in a wondering voice. The entire waterfront was lit by fire. The freight docks were burning, flames spreading to the converted apartments above, leaping from building to building. The infected silhouetted against the flames looked almost pitiful, almost human, their individual tragedies lost in the mass of their corruption. Did we start that? Svetlana asked, thinking of their torches, the sparks from breaking the gate. Does it matter? Dante replied, pulling harder on the oars. We're alive. They're not. But as they reached the far shore, a muddy embankment backed by forest, dark and unknown, the question hung in the air. How many of the infected burning in those buildings had been victims rather than monsters? How many had simply been in the wrong place when the virus hit, transformed through no fault of their own? Amarian spoke what they were all thinking. They were people once. They had names, families, favorite foods, songs that made them happy. The virus took that. But we can't forget it. We can't forget they were human. The boats beached on the muddy shore, and the survivors climbed out onto land that felt strange and uncertain after so many days of concrete and metal. They counted heads, 31 made it across. 2 had been lost in the tunnels, 1 to the infected on the dock, Joaquin's sacrifice buying the seconds they'd needed. The forest ahead was dark but quiet, no shrieks echoing through the trees. Dante organized a perimeter while Thessaly checked everyone for bites and injuries, her medical supplies nearly exhausted but her determination intact. Casimir stood at the water's edge, watching the city burn, the locket Esperanza had given him heavy in his pocket. What now? Hiroki asked, coming to stand beside him. Now we survive another day, Casimir replied. Then another. Until we find somewhere safe, or make somewhere safe, or die trying. Behind them, children were crying softly, adults whispering comfort they didn't quite believe, and somewhere in the forest, something moved through the darkness. But for this moment, they were alive, together, and the river between them and the burning city felt like the thinnest shield between hope and despair. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they moved into the forest, 31 survivors carrying the weight of all they'd lost and the desperate, fragile hope of what they might still find. 3 weeks passed before they found the town, if it could still be called that. Millbrook had been a rural community of maybe 200 people before the outbreak, surrounded by farmland and forest, the kind of place that appeared on maps only if you zoomed in far enough. Now it was something else, a graveyard of the world before, where houses stood empty and fields grew wild, but where the infected seemed fewer, slower, almost aimless. The survivors had changed in those 3 weeks. They'd lost 6 more people, 3 to infection from injuries that turned septic without proper antibiotics, 2 to an encounter with a pack of infected in an abandoned grocery store, and 1 elderly man whose heart simply gave out during a night march. They'd also found 12 others, scattered refugees who'd joined their group, bringing the count to 37. Casimir's hands had calluses now, permanent reminders of digging graves and building barricades. Thessaly had taken over the town's old medical clinic, working miracles with expired medications and makeshift equipment. Svetlana, the lawyer who'd fled in a torn business suit, now wore mud-stained jeans and had become their best scavenger, able to find supplies in places others overlooked. Hiroki had rigged solar panels to some of the houses, giving them limited electricity, a luxury that felt miraculous. Amarian had grown quieter. The boy who'd shown such strategic brilliance and unnatural calm during their escape now spent hours staring into distances only he could see, bearing the weight of decisions no 13-year-old should have to make. He'd saved them all, multiple times, but the cost was written in his eyes. The colony they built in Millbrook was fragile, held together by necessity and the understanding that trust was the only currency that mattered anymore. They established patrols, farming gardens in yards where roses used to grow, and a school of sorts where the children learned survival skills alongside reading and arithmetic, education for a world transformed. But the infected never fully disappeared. They wandered through occasionally, alone or in small groups, and each time the alarm bells rang, everyone grabbed weapons and prepared to defend what they'd built. The enemy had evolved too, the infected were slower now, weeks into their transformation, their bodies breaking down from lack of proper sustenance. But they were also more cunning, as if the virus was adapting, learning. On a cold morning in late autumn, Dante called a town meeting in what had once been Millbrook's community center. The entire colony gathered, 37 faces, representing perhaps the last free humans in a 100-mile radius. "We've received a radio transmission," Dante announced, and hope flared on every face before he continued. "It's not from a government or military. It's from another survivor group, about 40 kilometers north. They're offering to trade supplies, share information." He paused. "They want to meet face to face. Establish an alliance." "It could be a trap," Svetlana said immediately. "We don't know who these people are." "It could also be salvation," Renata countered, her daughter sleeping in her arms. "If there are other groups surviving, working together might be our only chance." Casimir looked at the faces around him, people he'd fought beside, bled with, buried. They'd become family in the way only shared trauma could forge. "We take precautions," he said. "Send a small delegation. Keep the location of Millbrook secret until we verify their intentions." "I'll go," Thessaly volunteered immediately. "No," Amarian said, speaking for the first time in days. "I'll go. They'll be less threatened by a kid. And if it is a trap." He didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. He was offering himself as an acceptable loss, and it broke their hearts. "We all go," Dante said firmly. "Not the whole colony, but a representative group. Show them we're strong enough to defend ourselves but willing to cooperate." He looked at Casimir. "You, me, Thessaly, Svetlana, Hiroki, and Amarian. Tomorrow at dawn." That night, Casimir couldn't sleep. He walked the perimeter of Millbrook, past the gardens they'd planted and the graves they'd dug, to the small memorial they'd erected, a wall of names, everyone they'd lost since the outbreak began. Joaquin's name was there, carved with a knife into weathered wood. Esperanza Martinez. Dozens of others, each representing a story cut short. He pulled out the silver locket Esperanza had given him, opening it to see the photo inside, a young woman with kind eyes, dead 10 years from cancer, now commemorated by a stranger in an apocalypse she'd never imagined. He'd meant to bury it somewhere beautiful, as she'd asked, but had instead kept it close, a reminder of the trust people placed in him, the responsibilities he carried. "You can't save everyone," Thessaly's voice came from behind him. She'd approached silently, her medical bag always within reach, her commitment to healing undiminished by the world's cruelty. "I know," Casimir replied. "But I have to try to save someone. Otherwise, what's the point?" She stood beside him, looking at the memorial wall. "Amarian asked me something today. He asked if I thought he was still a child, after everything he's done, everything he's seen." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth. That he lost his childhood the moment the outbreak started, and I'd give anything to return it to him, but I can't. None of us can." Her voice broke. "He's 13 years old, and he's killed infected to save us. He's watched people die. He makes strategic decisions that determine who lives and who doesn't. How do we give him back the innocence that's been stolen?" Casimir had no answer. The weight of what they'd survived, what they'd done to survive, wasn't something that could be absolved or forgotten. They carried it, all of them, and would carry it until the day they died, whether that was tomorrow or in 50 years. The delegation left at dawn, following the radio coordinates north through forest and abandoned farmland. They saw infected in the distance but avoided engagement, conserving energy and ammunition. The meeting point was an old fire tower, visible for kilometers, a landmark that could be approached from multiple directions. The other group was already there when they arrived, 11 people, armed but not threatening, led by a woman who introduced herself as Cordelia. She was perhaps 40, with scars on her face and hands that spoke of survival earned rather than granted. Her group had similar stories: escape from the cities, loss of loved ones, desperate adaptation to a world transformed. For hours, they talked. Shared information about infected movements, successful farming techniques, water purification methods. Cordelia's group had a shortwave radio capable of reaching farther than anything Millbrook possessed. They'd heard whispers of other survivor colonies, some as far as 1,000 kilometers away. The outbreak wasn't global, or if it was, some areas had contained it better than others. "There's talk of a scientific community in the mountains," Cordelia said. "Researchers who were already isolated when the outbreak hit, now working on understanding the virus, possibly even a cure or vaccine." "That's hope," Svetlana said carefully, "or a fairy tale." "Maybe both," Cordelia agreed. "But it's worth pursuing, isn't it? The alternative is accepting that this," she gestured at the ruined world around them, "is all we have left." As the meeting concluded, Amarian pulled Cordelia aside. Casimir watched from a distance as the boy spoke earnestly, his young face serious. When Amarian returned, Casimir asked what they'd discussed. "I asked her if she thought we were still human," Amarian said quietly. "After all the things we've done to survive. The people we've left behind, the impossible choices we've made." "And what did she say?" "She said humanity isn't about never making hard choices. It's about remembering why those choices matter. As long as we mourn what we've lost and protect what we still have, we're human." The boy looked up at Casimir with eyes that had seen too much. "I want to believe her." The delegation returned to Millbrook with news of the alliance, of other survivors, of the possibility of scientific communities working toward solutions. It was the first real hope they'd had since the outbreak began. But as they shared the information with the colony, Casimir noticed Amarian slip away, walking toward the memorial wall. Later, Casimir found the boy there, adding a new name to the wall in careful letters, Joaquin. Below it, Amarian had carved words, "He bought us tomorrow." "He was brave," Casimir said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He was scared," Amarian corrected. "But he did it anyway. That's what bravery is, right? Being terrified but doing what needs to be done." "Yes," Casimir agreed. "That's exactly what it is." As autumn turned toward winter, Millbrook prepared for the cold months ahead. They'd expanded their defenses, established trade routes with Cordelia's group and 2 other survivor colonies they'd made contact with. The infected were still out there, still dangerous, but the humans were learning to adapt faster, think smarter, work together. One evening, as snow began to fall, the first snow since the outbreak, the colony gathered around a fire in the community center. Someone had found a guitar, and rough voices sang songs from the world before, imperfect but beautiful in their defiance. Children laughed, adults planned for tomorrow, and for a moment, it almost felt like the world might heal. Thessaly sat with Amarian, teaching him to play chess using a set they'd scavenged, while Svetlana and Hiroki argued good-naturedly about the best way to expand the solar panel array. Dante cleaned his weapons with the care of a man who knew they'd be needed again soon. Renata's daughter slept peacefully, dreaming dreams that perhaps didn't include monsters. Casimir stood slightly apart, the silver locket in his hand. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he'd bury it in the garden they'd planted, where green things were fighting to grow despite the cold. Somewhere beautiful, as Esperanza had asked. A symbol of the world before, resting in the soil of the world they were building. But tonight, he held on to it, a reminder of promises kept and promises still owed. They'd survived, 37 people who'd faced the end of the world and refused to surrender. They'd lost so much, innocence, loved ones, the comfortable certainty of civilization, but they'd gained something too. Understanding that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about staying human. The fire crackled, the snow fell, and somewhere in the distance, an infected shrieked its endless hunger. But inside the community center, surrounded by people who'd become family through shared nightmare, Casimir felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too fragile, too easily broken. But possibility. The possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. That the children sleeping might grow up in a world rebuilding rather than ending. That the names on the memorial wall wouldn't be forgotten, and their sacrifices wouldn't be meaningless. Amarian caught his eye from across the room and smiled, a small, sad smile that acknowledged everything they'd lost but refused to surrender to despair. Casimir smiled back, understanding passing between them without words. They were the survivors, the ones who'd escaped the cities and the hordes, who'd crossed impossible distances and made impossible choices. They carried the weight of the dead and the responsibility for the living. And they would keep carrying it, one day at a time, until they couldn't anymore. The guitar played on, voices joined in imperfect harmony, and the snow covered the world outside in a blanket of white, hiding the scars beneath but not erasing them. Never erasing them. Because healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering, and choosing to build anyway. The fire burned low as the night deepened, and the survivors of Millbrook settled into sleep, weapons within reach, tomorrow uncertain, but together. Always together. And in the morning, when the sun rose on another day of the new world, they would wake, and work, and fight if necessary, and hope if possible. Because that's what survivors do. They survive. END